Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The stagecoach door swung open with a groan that matched the ache in Celestine's chest. Dust swirled around her worn leather boots as she stepped onto the hard-packed earth of Brimstone Creek, Wyoming Territory. The September sun beat down mercilessly, turning the main street into a shimmering ribbon of heat and disappointment. She clutched the single carpet bag that held everything she owned in this world: 3 dresses, a Bible from her dead mother, and the letters. Those cursed letters from Tobias Harrow, the man who'd promised her a home, a family, a fresh start away from the Pittsburgh factory that had stolen her youth one 14-hour shift at a time. Her fingers trembled as she smoothed the wrinkled blue calico of her traveling dress, trying to look presentable for the husband she'd never met. Around her, the town seemed to hold its breath. Shopkeepers paused in doorways. 2 women in expensive silk stopped their conversation to stare, and a group of cowboys outside the saloon whistled low. Celestine's cheeks burned, but she lifted her chin. She'd survived worse than small-town gossip. The station master, a grizzled man with kind eyes and tobacco-stained teeth, approached with his hat in his hands. Something about his expression made Celestine's stomach drop like a stone down a well. "You Miss Celestine Beaumont?" he asked, his voice gravelly with reluctance. When she nodded, he sighed so deeply his whole body seemed to deflate. "I'm real sorry, ma'am, real sorry. Tobias Harrow, your intended, he passed 3 weeks back, kicked by his own horse, of all the fool luck. Died the next morning, before Doc Pritchard could do a blessed thing." The words hit Celestine like physical blows. 3 weeks. She'd been on trains and stagecoaches for 9 days, traveling from Pennsylvania with hope wrapped around her heart like armor, and Tobias had been dead the entire time. The station master shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "His property's about 6 miles north, the Harrow homestead. His children are still out there, but ma'am, I don't rightly know what you're planning to do now." Children. The word echoed in Celestine's mind. Tobias had mentioned one child in his letters, a son named Samuel, age 12, who helped with the ranch. One child she could have loved, could have mothered with the tenderness that had nowhere to go after her own baby had been stillborn 5 years ago, after her husband had abandoned her the very next week, leaving her with nothing but debts and a broken heart. But now even that small dream was ashes. "How many children?" she heard herself ask, her voice sounding distant and strange. The station master's face crumpled with something that looked like pity, mixed with relief that someone had finally asked. "7, ma'am. 7 children, ranging from little May, who's barely 4, to Samuel, who's near 15 now. They've been alone out there since the funeral, and the town council's been arguing about what to do with them. There's talk of splitting them up, sending them to different families, maybe even the orphan train east." Celestine's world tilted on its axis. 7 children, alone, orphaned, facing separation from each other, the only family they had left in this brutal world. She thought of the factory in Pittsburgh, of the children who worked there with dead eyes and broken spirits, of the orphan trains that scattered siblings like seeds in the wind, never to see each other again. She thought of her own empty arms, her own desperate loneliness, the way she'd spent 5 years sleepwalking through a life that had lost all color. Something fierce and hot kindled in her chest, something that felt almost like purpose. "Take me to them," she said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. The station master's eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. "Ma'am, you don't understand. 7 children ain't no joke. They ain't got much money. The ranch is barely holding together, and you don't owe them nothing. You could get back on that stage tomorrow, head back east, or try another—" "I said take me to them." Celestine's voice cut through his protest like a knife through butter. Her hands had stopped trembling. Her heart, which had been shattered and hollow for so long, suddenly beat with something that felt almost like hope, Or maybe it was just stubborn defiance against a world that kept taking and taking and taking. The station master studied her face for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "I'll get my wagon. But ma'am, I gotta warn you, those children, they're hurting something fierce, and they ain't exactly trusting of strangers, especially after losing their ma 2 years back and now their pa. Samuel, the oldest boy, he's got a hard edge to him now. They all do." Celestine simply nodded, adjusting her grip on her carpet bag. As she waited in the scorching sun, watching the station master disappear around the corner, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to jump into waters she couldn't see the bottom of. The wagon ride to the Harrow homestead took nearly 2 hours, winding through prairie grass that stretched endlessly beneath a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Celestine sat beside the station master, whose name was Franklin Dodds. He'd finally introduced himself and tried to piece together how her life had led to this impossible moment. 6 months ago, she'd been sorting through her landlady's newspaper when an advertisement had caught her eye. "Widower rancher seeking companionship and help with household. Must be of good moral character and willing to embrace frontier life." The words had seemed like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. She'd responded that very night, her hand cramping as she'd written by candlelight about her skills in cooking, sewing, and keeping house, carefully omitting the factory work, the stillborn baby, the husband who'd called her cursed and walked away. Tobias's first letter had arrived 3 weeks later, written in careful, blocky handwriting that suggested a man more comfortable with cattle than correspondence. He'd painted a picture of a modest ranch with good water, decent grazing land, and a son who needed a mother's influence. He'd been honest about his late wife Martha, taken by fever 2 years prior, and about the loneliness that filled his days like dust. His second letter had been warmer, asking about her favorite foods, her thoughts on child rearing, whether she minded animals in the house. By the fourth letter, he'd proposed marriage, promising a simple ceremony and a partnership built on mutual respect and hard work. Nowhere, not in any of the 6 letters Celestine had read and reread until the paper grew soft as cloth, had he mentioned 6 other children. The omission felt like betrayal, even though Tobias was beyond answering for it now. Had he feared she'd refuse? Had he planned to spring the truth on her after she'd traveled too far to turn back? Or had grief and desperation simply made him believe that mentioning one child was enough, that the rest were details that could be worked out later? Franklin cleared his throat, pulling Celestine from her spiraling thoughts. "Tobias was a good man," he said carefully, as if testing the words for truth. "Bit overwhelmed after Martha died, I reckon. 7 young'uns is a lot for any man to handle alone, especially when he's trying to keep a ranch afloat. Martha was the glue that held that family together, warm as summer sunshine and twice as bright. When she passed, something in Tobias just dimmed. The wagon hit a rut, jostling them both. Celestine gripped the wooden seat, her knuckles white. Why didn't anyone in town help? The question came out sharper than she'd intended, but Franklin didn't seem offended. He just sighed, his weathered face creasing with something that might have been shame. "Some folks tried at first, brought casseroles, offered to watch the children. But Tobias, he had his pride, kept saying he could manage, that the Harrows had always taken care of their own. After a while, people stopped offering. That's how it goes sometimes. Folks get busy with their own troubles, and before you know it, a family's drowning and nobody's throwing them a rope." Celestine absorbed this, watching the landscape roll past. She'd seen this pattern before in Pittsburgh, how quickly communities could forget those who were struggling, how easy it was to become invisible when you needed help the most. The frontier was supposed to be different, full of hardy souls who looked out for each other, but apparently human nature was human nature, whether you were in a crowded city or the wide open West. "What are their names?" she asked suddenly. "The children, all of them." Franklin's expression softened, as if the question itself was a kind of test she'd just passed. "Samuel's the oldest at 15. He's the one Tobias mentioned, I'd wager." Good with horses, stronger than he looks, but carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders now. Then there's Esther. She's 13, quiet but sharp as a tack. Takes care of the younger ones like a second mama. After her comes the twins, Jacob and Judith, just turned 11. Wild as March hares, those two, but good hearts. Then there's Nora. She's 8, sweet little thing with her mama's red hair. He paused and Celestine prompted him gently. That's 5. You said 7. Franklin nodded, his voice dropping lower. Thomas is 6, small for his age, but tough. He don't talk much since his mama died. Doc thinks it's the grief, that he'll come around eventually. And then there's May, just 4 years old. Barely remembers her mama at all, which might be a mercy or a curse, depending on how you look at it. 7 names, 7 souls, 7 children who'd lost everything and were about to lose each other if the town council had its way. Celestine's mind raced, trying to calculate what feeding 7 children would cost, what clothing them would require, how one woman could possibly manage a household of that size while also somehow keeping a ranch running. The math didn't work. It was impossible. It was insane. And yet, as the Harrow homestead finally came into view on the horizon, a weathered house with a sagging porch and a barn that leaned slightly to the left, Celestine felt that fierce, hot purpose flare brighter in her chest. Sometimes the only sane response to an insane world was to do the impossible thing anyway. The Harrow homestead looked like abandonment felt, weathered, weary, barely holding itself together through sheer stubborn will. The house was a simple 2-story structure with wood siding that had once been painted white but had faded to the color of old bones. Several shutters hung crooked. One window on the upper floor was cracked and patched with oiled paper, and the porch steps sagged in the middle like a tired horse's back. The yard was bare dirt, packed hard by years of foot traffic, with a chicken coop listing to one side and a vegetable garden that had gone mostly to weeds. Beyond the house stood the barn, its roof patched with mismatched boards, and a corral where 3 horses stood with their heads low, tails swishing at flies. It was the kind of place that showed the fingerprints of hard work and harder times, where every repair had been made with whatever materials were at hand, and every decision had been a choice between bad and worse. As Franklin's wagon rolled to a stop, the front door opened slowly, like a mouth preparing to speak. A tall boy emerged first. Samuel? Celestine knew immediately. He had his father's height and broad shoulders, but his face was all angles and wariness, eyes dark as river stones and just as hard. He couldn't have been more than 15, but he moved like someone much older, like someone who'd already buried his childhood alongside his parents. Behind him came a girl with honey-colored braids and a flour-smudged apron. Esther, the 13-year-old second mother. Then the others spilled out. The twins Jacob and Judith, identical right down to the suspicious expressions on their freckled faces. Nora with her shock of red hair that caught the sunlight like copper wire. Thomas, small and silent, half hiding behind his older siblings. And finally May, the 4-year-old, clutching a rag doll with one arm missing. 7 pairs of eyes fixed on Celestine with an intensity that made her feel like a specimen under glass. Not one of them smiled. "Who's this?" Samuel's voice came out rough, almost aggressive. He crossed his arms over his chest, a gesture that was equal parts defensive and defiant. Franklin climbed down from the wagon with a grunt, brushing dust from his pants. "This here's Miss Celestine Beaumont. She came out from Pennsylvania well, she was supposed to marry your pa." A ripple of reaction moved through the children. Esther's hand flew to her mouth. Jacob and Judith exchanged sharp glances. Nora took a step backward. Only Samuel remained rigid, his jaw working as if he were chewing on nails. "Pa's dead," he said flatly, as if Celestine might not know this crucial fact. "Ain't no wedding happening, so unless you're here to gawk at the orphans before they haul us off to different counties, you can turn that wagon right back around." The hostility in his voice was like a slap, but Celestine understood it. She'd used that same tone herself once, when the world had kicked her down and she'd decided to grow thorns rather than let anyone close enough to hurt her again. "I know your father's dead," Celestine said quietly, meeting Samuel's hard stare without flinching. "Mr. Dodds told me. I also know there are 7 of you, that you've been alone for 3 weeks, and that the town council wants to split you up." She took a breath, feeling the weight of what she was about to say settle on her shoulders like a yoke. "I'm here because I traveled 9 days to start a new life, and I'm not turning back. If you'll have me, I'll stay. I'll help with the house, the children, whatever needs doing. I won't be your mother. I know you had one, and nobody can replace Martha Harrow. But I can be—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I can be someone who stands between you and the world that wants to tear you apart." The silence that followed was so complete. Celestine could hear the wind moving through the prairie grass, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the porch boards as Esther shifted her weight. Samuel's expression didn't soften, but something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. "We don't need charity," he said finally, but the edge in his voice had dulled slightly. "We've been managing fine." "I can see that," Celestine lied gently, taking in the too-thin faces, the patched clothing, the way little May's doll was held together with rough stitches. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a trade. You need help keeping this place running, so the council doesn't have cause to separate you. I need a place to stay and a purpose for my life. Seems to me we could help each other." Esther stepped forward then, and Celestine saw the exhaustion carved into the girl's young face like words into stone. "Can you cook?" Esther asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been trying, but I can't get the bread right, and the chickens stopped laying good, and Thomas won't eat nothing but bacon, and I don't know how to make him eat proper, and—" Her voice cracked, and suddenly she was just a 13-year-old girl who'd been playing adult for too long, tears spilling down her cheeks. Celestine moved without thinking, crossing the distance between them and pulling Esther into her arms. The girl resisted for only a moment before collapsing against her, sobbing with the kind of exhaustion that comes from holding everything together with willpower alone. Over Esther's shaking shoulders, Celestine looked at the other children, at Samuel's carefully blank face, at the twins' wide eyes, at Nora biting her lip, at Thomas watching with an expression too old for his 6 years, at little May sucking her thumb. "I can cook," Celestine said softly. "I can fix bread and chickens and 100 other things, and I'm not going anywhere." 3 days after Celestine arrived at the Harrow homestead, Franklin Dodds returned with the news that turned her blood cold. She'd been in the kitchen teaching Esther how to knead bread dough properly, her hands buried in flour up to her wrists, when she heard the wagon approach. Through the window, she could see Franklin's grim expression, and behind him, 3 other men on horseback, members of the town council, she realized, recognizing them from her brief stop in Brimstone Creek. Her stomach dropped like a stone. Samuel appeared in the doorway, his face already shuddered with defensive anger. "What do they want?" he asked, his voice tight. Celestine wiped her hands on her apron, leaving white streaks across the faded fabric. "I don't know, but we'll face them together." She wasn't sure where the "we" had come from. She'd only been here 3 days. 3 days of learning names and preferences, of cooking meals that actually filled bellies, of listening to whispered nightmares and mending torn clothes. But somehow, impossibly, these children had already worked their way under her skin. The men dismounted with the slow deliberation of people who've come to deliver bad news and want to delay it as long as possible. The leader was a man named Cyrus Blackwell, owner of the largest mercantile in town, with silver hair and a belly that spoke of prosperity. Beside him stood Reverend Ashford, thin as a rail and twice as rigid, and Deputy Marshal Cohen, a younger man who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. They gathered in the front yard while the children assembled on the porch like soldiers preparing for battle. Celestine stood at the front, positioning herself between the men and the children without consciously deciding to do so. Miss Beaumont, Cyrus began, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of a man used to getting his way. We've come to discuss the situation regarding the Harrow children. The town council has reached a decision. Celestine's hands clenched in the folds of her skirt, but her voice came out steady. What decision might that be, Mr. Blackwell? Cyrus exchanged glances with the Reverend before continuing. It's been determined that this arrangement, you staying here with 7 children, unmarried and unrelated, is improper. Moreover, the financial reality is undeniable. The Harrow Ranch is barely solvent. There are debts outstanding at several businesses in town, and winter is coming. One woman cannot possibly manage this property and raise 7 children alone. He pulled a paper from his coat pocket, unfolding it with the crisp efficiency of someone announcing a verdict. The council has arranged placements for all the children. Samuel is old enough to hire on as a ranch hand with the Pritchard family. Esther will go to work for Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house. The twins have been accepted by a farming family 2 counties over. The younger 3 will be sent east on the next orphan train to find suitable families. The words hung in the air like gun smoke, and for a moment, nobody moved. Then May began to cry, a thin, confused wail that seemed to break the spell. Thomas grabbed her hand, his small face white as paper. Nora pressed against Esther, who looked like she might faint. The twins moved closer together, their earlier wildness replaced by naked terror. No! The word came from Samuel, sharp as a blade. He stepped forward, his young face blazing with fury. You can't split us up. This is our home. Our pa built this place with his own hands, and our ma is buried on that hill behind the barn. You got no right. We have every right, boy, Cyrus interrupted, his smooth voice hardening. The law is clear. 7 orphan minors cannot remain unsupervised on failing property. The council has a responsibility to ensure your welfare, and this decision has been made in your best interests. Our best interests? Samuel's voice cracked with emotion. You're talking about tearing apart the only family we got left, sending the little ones away on a train to God knows where, and you call that our best interests? Reverend Ashford stepped forward, his hands clasped as if in prayer. My son, I understand your distress, but you must see reason. Miss Beaumont is a stranger, an unmarried woman with no legal standing. Even if her intentions are pure, the situation is untenable. The scandal alone, then I'll marry her. The words came from Celestine's mouth before her brain had fully formed the thought. 7 heads on the porch swiveled toward her in shock. The 3 council members froze, their expressions ranging from surprise to outrage. Only Franklin Dodds, standing slightly apart from the others, allowed himself a small, knowing smile. Celestine stepped forward, her heart hammering, but her voice clear. You say the situation is improper because I'm unmarried and unrelated. Fine. I'll marry Samuel. He's 15. Young, yes, but legal with parental consent in the territory. We'll marry. I'll become a Harrow legally, and I'll have every right to keep this family together and manage this property. The silence that followed was absolute. Cyrus Blackwell's face turned an alarming shade of purple. That's preposterous. The boy's a child. The law says otherwise, Celestine countered, surprised by her own boldness. And Tobias Harrow is dead, which means Samuel is the head of this household. If he consents to the marriage, there's nothing legally preventing it. She turned to Samuel, whose expression had shifted from shock to something calculating and sharp. I know it sounds crazy, she said quietly, speaking only to him, ignoring the sputtering council members. It would be a marriage in name only, just a legal arrangement to keep your family together. I'm asking nothing from you except your name and your trust. When you turn 18, we can dissolve it if you want, but this way, I become your legal wife and the stepmother to your siblings. The council would have no grounds to separate you. Samuel stared at her for a long moment, and Celestine could see the weight of impossible decisions pressing down on this boy who'd already lost too much. He looked at his siblings, at Esther's tear-streaked face, at the twins clutching each other, at Thomas's blank stare, at May's continued crying, at Nora's wide, frightened eyes. Then he looked back at Celestine, and something in his expression shifted. "All right," he said, his voice rough but certain. "I'll marry you. If that's what it takes to keep us together, I'll do it." The word should have sounded absurd. A 15-year-old boy agreeing to marry a 28-year-old woman he'd known for 3 days. But in that moment, standing in the dusty yard of a failing ranch with 7 orphan children and 3 disapproving men, it felt like the sanest thing in the world. The wedding took place 3 days later in Reverend Ashford's cramped church, and it was the strangest ceremony Brimstone Creek had ever witnessed. Celestine wore her best dress, a dove-grey cotton with black trim that she'd brought for Sunday services, while Samuel wore his father's suit, hastily taken in by Esther's quick fingers, the sleeves still a bit too long and the shoulders a bit too wide. They stood before the altar like soldiers, facing a firing squad, both understanding that this ceremony was a strategic maneuver rather than a romantic union. The church was nearly empty, just Franklin Dodd serving as witness, the 6 Harrow children filling the front pew, and Deputy Marshal Cohen representing the town council, since Cyrus Blackwell had refused to attend what he called a mockery of holy matrimony. Reverend Ashford himself looked like he'd swallowed something bitter, his lips pressed into a thin line as he rushed through the vows, with none of the warmth or blessing usually bestowed upon new couples. "Do you, Samuel Joseph Harrow, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The Reverend's voice was clipped, disapproving. Samuel's hand trembled slightly where it held Celestine's, but his voice came out strong. "I do." "And do you, Celestine Margaret Beaumont, take this boy—" Ashford caught himself. "This man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Celestine looked at Samuel's young face, seeing both the boy he still was and the man he was being forced to become too soon. She thought of her first marriage, entered into with romantic hope, and ended in crushing disappointment. This marriage was different, built not on love or passion but on something perhaps more solid, shared necessity and mutual protection. "I do," she said clearly, and meant it. The Reverend pronounced them husband and wife with the enthusiasm of a man reading a death sentence. There was no kiss, no celebration, just the scratching of pen on paper as they signed the marriage certificate that would transform Celestine from an interloper into a legal member of the Harrow family. When it was done, Samuel's shoulders sagged with visible relief, and Esther burst into tears, happy ones this time. Back at the homestead, Celestine had prepared a special meal using the last of her carefully hoarded money: a roast chicken, mashed potatoes with real butter, green beans from the garden that she'd managed to salvage, and an apple pie that had taken hours to perfect. It wasn't much, but seated around the scarred wooden table with all 7 children, it felt like a feast. For the first time since she'd arrived, the atmosphere was something other than tense wariness. The twins actually laughed when Jacob accidentally flicked a potato at Judith's nose. Nora asked for seconds. Thomas ate without being coaxed. And May climbed into Celestine's lap without fear, her small body warm and trusting in a way that made Celestine's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Tell us about Pennsylvania," Esther asked shyly. "What's it like where you came from?" Celestine hesitated, then decided these children deserved honesty. She told them about the factory where she'd worked 14-hour days in choking heat, about the tenement building where 4 families shared a single privy, about the baby she'd lost and the husband who had abandoned her. She didn't sugarcoat it or make herself into a tragic heroine. She just told the truth about hardship and survival, about learning to stand up after being knocked down, about the difference between giving up and moving forward. The children listened with a stillness that suggested they understood more than most adults would credit. When she finished, Samuel spoke for the first time since they'd returned from the church. "You didn't have to stay," he said, his voice careful. "You could have gotten back on that stage, tried again somewhere else. Why'd you really stay here?" It was a fair question, and Celestine considered it seriously. Why had she stayed? It would have been easier to leave, to find another opportunity, another fresh start that didn't involve 7 children and a failing ranch and a marriage of legal convenience to a 15-year-old boy. I stayed because I was tired of being alone, she said finally. I stayed because when I looked at you all standing on that porch, I saw myself. People the world had decided weren't worth the trouble. People everyone else wanted to sort into neat categories and ship off to where they'd be less inconvenient. I stayed because sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born into. And I stayed because... She paused, surprised by the tears gathering in her eyes. Because I think maybe you needed me as much as I needed you. The silence that followed was different than the hostile quiet of that first day. This was the silence of walls coming down, of hearts that had been locked tight beginning to crack open just enough to let light in. Esther reached across the table and took Celestine's hand, squeezing it gently. The twins nodded simultaneously, as if they'd reached some unspoken agreement. Nora smiled shyly. Thomas, still silent, pushed his chair closer to Celestine's, and May, already half asleep in her lap, murmured something that sounded like mama. The word hung in the air like a benediction. Celestine felt Samuel's eyes on her and turned to meet his gaze. For the first time since she'd arrived, his expression had softened, the hard edges smoothed by something that might have been hope, or maybe just exhaustion too deep to maintain his defenses any longer. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for what you did today, for what you're trying to do." Celestine nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. That night, as she lay in Martha Harrow's old bed in the room that was now hers, listening to the sounds of 7 children breathing and dreaming in nearby rooms, Celestine understood that she'd somehow stumbled into the life she'd been searching for all along. It wasn't the life she'd imagined. It was harder and stranger and more complicated. But it was real. And it was hers. And for the first time in years, she felt like she'd finally come home. The first snow came early that year, sweeping across the Wyoming prairie in late October like a wool blanket thrown over the world. Celestine stood on the sagging porch, watching white flakes settle into every crack and hollow, transforming the tired homestead into something almost magical. Behind her, she could hear the children moving through the house. Esther teaching Nora how to card wool, the twins arguing over some imagined slight, May's high voice, singing a song with half the words wrong. The sounds had become as familiar as her own heartbeat in the 6 weeks since she'd arrived. But underneath the warmth of domestic routine, anxiety gnawed at Celestine's stomach like a persistent rat. Winter in Wyoming was nothing like winter in Pennsylvania. Here, storms could bury a house in snow taller than a man, could trap families for weeks, could kill livestock and people with equal indifference. And the Harrow homestead was desperately unprepared. The barn roof still leaked, several windows needed weather stripping, the chicken coop required reinforcement, and most critically, they didn't have nearly enough food stored to last until spring. Samuel appeared beside her, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. At 15, he was technically her husband, but they'd fallen into an easy partnership that felt more like siblings or fellow soldiers in a shared battle. "We need to talk," he said quietly, and the seriousness in his voice made Celestine's anxiety spike higher. They moved to the barn, where they could speak privately, their boots crunching through the thin layer of snow. Inside, the 3 horses, Sage, Dusty, and Belle, nickered softly from their stalls. Samuel leaned against a support post, his young face creased with worry that aged him beyond his years. "I've been going through Pa's ledgers," he began, pulling a worn notebook from inside his coat. "It's worse than I thought. We owe Blackwell's Mercantile $47, the feed store another $32, and there's a bank note on the property that's due in March, $200. The numbers hit Celestine like physical blows. She'd known money was tight, but this was catastrophic. "How much do we have?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would be bad. $17.35. Pa sold most of the cattle before he died, trying to stay current on debts. We've got 15 head left, but they won't fetch good prices until spring, and we need them for breeding stock anyway. Samuel's voice cracked slightly. Celestine, I don't know how to make this work. I've been trying to figure it out every night, running the numbers over and over, and I don't see a way through. Celestine took the ledger from his hands, studying the careful columns of numbers in Tobias Harrow's blocky handwriting. The man had tried. She could see evidence of that in every desperate calculation, every attempt to squeeze value from a property that had been slowly bleeding out for years. Martha's death had been the first blow, Tobias's the second, and now winter was coming to deliver the third and possibly final strike. We need income, she said slowly, her mind racing through possibilities. Something we can do now before winter really hits. What skills do we have? What can we sell or trade that wouldn't cripple us long term? Samuel shook his head. There's nothing. Pa already sold everything that wasn't nailed down. The only thing we've got in abundance is... He trailed off, his eyes suddenly focusing on something past Celestine's shoulder. She turned to follow his gaze. In the corner of the barn, stacked against the wall, were bolts of fabric. Beautiful fabric in colors that seemed almost too vibrant for this dusty space. There had to be 20 or 30 bolts, wrapped in protective cloth to keep them clean. What is all this? Celestine asked, moving closer. She unwrapped one bolt and gasped. The fabric was exquisite. Fine wool dyed a deep burgundy, the kind of material that would cost a fortune in any city shop. Samuel's expression had gone complicated, proud and sad at once. It was Ma's. She was a seamstress before she married Pa, real talented with needle and thread. Pa bought her all this fabric as an anniversary present the year before she died. Said she should make herself beautiful dresses instead of always working herself ragged. But she never got the chance to use it. After she passed, Pa couldn't bear to look at it, so he stored it out here. Celestine's heart was pounding now, her mind spinning with possibility. Samuel, this fabric is worth a fortune. Just one of these bolts could buy food for a month, if we sold it all. No. His voice was sharp, almost angry. That was Ma's. It's all we have left of her dreams. We can't just sell it off like it's nothing. Celestine understood his resistance. These bolts represented Martha Harrow's hopes, her plans for a future that had never materialized. But they also represented survival for her children. What if we didn't sell the fabric? Celestine said slowly, an idea taking shape. What if we used it? Your mother was a seamstress. I can sew. Not as well as she probably could, but well enough. What if we made things? Dresses, shirts, coats. Winter's coming, and people need warm clothes. We could sell finished pieces instead of raw fabric. Honor your mother's skill instead of just liquidating her materials. Samuel stared at her, conflict warring across his face. Finally, he reached out and touched one of the bolts, his fingers gentle as if stroking something alive. Ma would want us to survive, he said quietly. She'd want us to stay together. If using her fabric helps us do that. He trailed off, then nodded decisively. Let's do it. The next 3 weeks were a blur of aching fingers and burning eyes. Celestine set up a sewing operation in the main room, pushing furniture aside to create space for cutting and stitching. Esther, it turned out, had inherited her mother's gift with a needle, and together they worked from dawn until late into the night, transforming Martha's beautiful fabric into practical, well-made garments. The twins helped with cutting patterns, Nora with pinning seams, even little May with sorting buttons. Thomas, still mostly silent, kept the fire going and brought them tea when their hands cramped. Samuel took finished pieces into town twice a week, selling to the mercantile and directly to families preparing for winter. The first week brought in $8. The second week, $12. By the third week, word had spread about the quality of Harrow garments, and Samuel came home with orders, actual orders, for custom work that would pay premium prices. Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house wanted 5 wool dresses for her girls. The banker's wife wanted a coat in that beautiful burgundy wool. Rancher Pritchard needed shirts for his hired men. For the first time since Celestine had arrived, hope felt like more than just stubborn defiance. It felt real. The blizzard hit on a Tuesday in mid-November, descending on the prairie with such sudden fury that it seemed like the sky itself had declared war. Celestine had been hanging laundry when the temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, the wind shifting from a gentle breeze to a howling monster that tore the sheets from her hands and sent them flying like white ghosts across the yard. "Everyone inside! Now!" Samuel's voice cut through the wind as he sprinted from the barn, his arms loaded with extra firewood. The children scrambled to obey, even May understanding the urgency in his tone. Celestine grabbed what laundry she could salvage and ran for the house, the wind literally pushing her the last few feet. Samuel slammed the door behind them and dropped the wooden bar across it, sealing them in. Within an hour, snow was falling so thickly that they couldn't see the barn from the house, and the wind screamed around the eaves like something alive and angry. They huddled in the main room around the stove, blankets wrapped around shoulders, while the storm raged outside with a violence that made the house groan and shudder. Celestine had weathered storms before, but nothing like this. This was elemental fury, nature reminding humans exactly how small and fragile they really were. The children were frightened, but trying not to show it. Esther held May close, singing softly. The twins sat pressed against each other, their earlier wildness subdued. Nora gripped Celestine's hand so tightly it hurt. Thomas stared at the window where snow was already piling halfway up the frame, and Samuel paced like a caged animal, checking and rechecking their supplies of firewood, food, and water. "How long do these storms usually last?" Celestine asked Franklin Dodds, who'd been visiting when the storm hit and was now trapped with them. "Day, maybe 2, he answered, but his eyes said he wasn't certain. "Sometimes longer. Lost a family 2 winters back. Storm lasted 5 days and they ran out of firewood. Froze to death 20 feet from their own barn." The first night was manageable. They cooked a hot meal on the stove, told stories by lamplight, and put the children to bed in layers of blankets. But the storm didn't stop. Day 2 brought even heavier snow and winds that shook the house so violently that Celestine feared the roof might tear away. By day 3, the woodpile inside was running low, and Samuel announced what they all feared. Someone would have to go to the barn for more wood and to check on the horses. "I'll go," he said, already pulling on his heaviest coat. "I'm the strongest. I know the layout best." "You're 15 years old," Celestine interrupted sharply. "If you get lost in that whiteout, I'll have to explain to your siblings why I let their brother die." "So what? You're going? You'll get lost even faster." The argument might have escalated, but Franklin cleared his throat. "We'll go together. 3 of us. Me, Samuel, and Celestine. We rope ourselves together like a chain, make the trip quick, and come straight back. Safety in numbers." The journey to the barn was only 40 feet, but it felt like 40 miles. The moment they opened the door, the wind tried to rip it from their hinges. Snow blasted into their faces with stinging force, and the cold was so intense it felt like knives in the lungs. They'd roped themselves together at the waist with a 6-foot length between each person, Franklin in front, Samuel in the middle, Celestine bringing up the rear. They moved slowly, feeling their way through snow that was already waist deep, each step an act of faith that the ground was still beneath them. The world had been reduced to white noise and white blindness, the barn invisible even though Celestine knew it had to be close. Franklin stopped suddenly, and Samuel bumped into him. Celestine into Samuel. "I can't see it." Franklin's voice was barely audible over the wind. "The barn should be right here, but I can't." Panic flooded in Celestine's chest. If they couldn't find the barn, they couldn't find their way back to the house either. They could wander in circles until they collapsed from exhaustion or cold, could die within sight of safety, without ever knowing how close they'd been. Then Samuel did something extraordinary. He cupped his hands around his mouth and screamed with everything in his 15-year-old lungs, "Esther, ring the bell!" It took a moment for Celestine to understand. The house had a bell by the front door, a dinner bell that Martha Harrow had used to call her family home, and brilliant, wonderful Esther understood her brother's desperate signal. Through the roar of the storm came the clear, sweet sound of the bell ringing. Once, twice, 3 times. It gave them direction, an auditory lighthouse in the white chaos. They adjusted course, shuffling through the drifts, and suddenly the barn's dark shape loomed before them like salvation. Inside, the horses were terrified but alive, stamping and whinnying in their stalls. Samuel and Franklin loaded wood into a canvas carrier, while Celestine checked on the animals, giving them reassuring pats and speaking softly to calm their panic. "We need to take them back to the house," Samuel said suddenly. "If this storm keeps up, the barn could collapse. They'll freeze out here." Franklin looked dubious. "Horses in the house? Your ma would have had a fit." "Ma's dead," Samuel said flatly. "And these horses are worth more than everything else we own combined. They're coming with us." So began the surreal journey back. 3 humans and 3 horses roped together, shuffling through the blizzard like some strange ark parade. Esther kept ringing the bell in steady intervals, guiding them home. When they finally crashed through the door, bringing a whirlwind of snow and 3 panicked horses with them, the house erupted into chaos and relief. The children helped dry the horses and settle them in a corner of the main room, while Celestine and Franklin worked to seal the door again. It was absurd. 7 children and 3 horses crammed into a small house, but it was also the most alive Celestine had felt in years. That night, packed together for warmth with children and horses sharing the same space, Samuel finally spoke the truth that had been building since Celestine arrived. "I was going to run away," he said quietly into the darkness. "After Pa died, before you came, I was going to pack up and leave in the night, go somewhere I could work and send money back for the others. I thought it was the only way." "Why didn't you?" Celestine asked. "Because you showed up and did something even crazier than running away. You stayed, and you made me believe that maybe we could actually keep this family together." His voice cracked. "I don't tell you enough, but thank you. Thank you for being crazy enough to stay." The storm finally broke on the 5th day, leaving the world buried under 3 feet of snow that sparkled like diamonds in the sunshine. The children burst from the house like prisoners freed from captivity, shouting and throwing snowballs, their laughter ringing across the white landscape. Even Thomas smiled, actually smiled, as he helped May build a lopsided snowman. Samuel and Franklin dug paths to the barn and the well, while Celestine stood on the porch, watching her strange cobbled-together family play in the snow, and felt something profound settle in her chest. They had survived. Against odds that should have crushed them, they had made it through. But survival, Celestine was learning, was more than just not dying. It was about building something that could last beyond the immediate crisis. The sewing income was helping, but the banknote due in March still loomed like an executioner's blade. $200 might as well have been $2,000. They needed a miracle, and Celestine was fresh out of belief in miracles. That afternoon, while the children were still playing outside and Samuel was working in the barn, Celestine decided to explore the parts of the house she'd avoided, until now. She'd been living in Martha Harrow's bedroom, sleeping in Martha's bed, cooking with Martha's pots, and mending with Martha's needles, always aware that she was walking through another woman's life, occupying spaces that still held her ghost. But the attic remained untouched, and Celestine found herself drawn to the narrow stairs that led upward from the second-floor hallway. The attic was cramped and dim, with only a small window letting in dusty light. Boxes and trunks lined the walls, and the air smelled of age and forgotten things. Celestine moved carefully through the space, not quite sure what she was looking for, but feeling that pull of curiosity that humans can never quite resist. Most of the boxes contained ordinary things: old clothes, broken tools, children's toys that had outlived their usefulness. But one trunk, pushed far into a corner and covered with a canvas tarp, caught her attention. It was locked, but the lock was old and rusted, and when Celestine pried at it with a screwdriver she'd brought up, it gave way with a screech of protesting metal. Inside the trunk, wrapped in layers of cloth, was a collection of items that made Celestine's breath catch. First, there were journals. Martha Harrow's journals, 5 of them, filled with neat handwriting that chronicled the life of the woman who'd lived here before. Celestine knew she should probably leave them unread, that journals were private things even after death. But she was only human, and curiosity won. She opened the most recent journal to a random page and began to read. November 1878. Tobias doesn't know about the money. I can't tell him. His pride would never allow it. But Mother left me $300 in her will, and I've been adding to it slowly, skimming a few cents here and there from the egg money. It's my safety net, my insurance that if anything ever happened to Tobias, the children would have something. I've hidden it where no one would think to look, somewhere that connects to my happiest memories with the children. Esther knows about the secret place, though she doesn't know what's hidden there. If something happens to me, I trust she'll remember. Celestine's heart was pounding now. $300, enough to pay the banknote and have money left over for winter supplies. But where had Martha hidden it? And did Esther actually know, or had grief erased that particular memory? Celestine carefully gathered the journals and descended from the attic, her mind racing. She found Esther in the kitchen, peeling potatoes for dinner, humming softly to herself. The girl looked up with a smile that was becoming more frequent these days, the weight of responsibility slowly lifting from her thin shoulders now that she had help carrying it. Esther, Celestine began carefully, sitting down across from her. I need to ask you something about your mother, and I want you to know that I'm not trying to pry or replace her, but it's important. Esther's smile faded, replaced by wary concern. What is it? Celestine showed her the journal, open to the relevant page. Your mother wrote about a secret place, somewhere connected to happy memories with you children. She said you knew about it, even if you didn't know what was hidden there. Do you remember anything like that? Esther stared at the journal for a long moment, her eyes scanning her mother's familiar handwriting with an expression of mingled pain and longing. Then, slowly, her face transformed. The willow tree, she whispered. There's a willow tree about half a mile east of here near the creek. Ma used to take us there in summer for picnics. She said it was her favorite place on earth because it was where Pa proposed to her. She and I would go there sometimes, just the 2 of us, and she'd tell me stories about when she was young. There's a hollow in the trunk where we used to leave notes for each other, like a secret mailbox. Celestine felt electricity course through her. Can you take me there? The journey through 3 feet of snow was difficult, but Esther led the way with the certainty of muscle memory, following paths that were invisible under the white blanket but clearly marked in her mind. The willow tree, when they finally reached it, was a magnificent thing even in winter. Ancient branches drooping gracefully, trunk thick as a horse's body, roots spreading out like the fingers of a buried giant. Esther went straight to a spot about 4 feet up the trunk, where the bark had grown around a natural hollow, creating a space just big enough for a person to reach inside. Her hand disappeared into the hollow, feeling around. Then her face changed, shock and hope mingling in equal measure. There's something here, she breathed. She pulled out a metal box, not large but heavy, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept it protected from weather and time. Her hands shaking, Esther opened the box. Inside were neat stacks of bills and coins, savings accumulated penny by penny, hidden away against disaster. Celestine didn't need to count it to know they'd found Martha's safety net. The 2 of them stood in the snow beneath the willow tree, holding the box between them, and both began to cry. Esther for the mother, who'd loved her children enough to plan for their protection, even after her death. Celestine for the grace of a woman she'd never met, but who'd somehow reached across death to save her children one more time. She knew, Esther sobbed. She knew something might happen, and she made sure we'd be okay. She's still taking care of us." Celestine pulled the girl into her arms, and they stood there in the winter silence, mourning and grateful in equal measure. When they finally trudged back to the house, Celestine knew they'd found more than money. They'd found proof that love doesn't end with death, that a mother's protection can extend beyond the grave, and that sometimes miracles come wrapped in oilcloth and buried in the secret places of the heart. Word travels fast in small towns, especially word about money. Within a week of paying off the banknote and selling accounts at the mercantile and feed store, Cyrus Blackwell appeared at the Harrow homestead with the entire town council in tow. This time, they brought a lawyer, a thin man named Garrison with spectacles and a briefcase that looked expensive enough to feed a family for a month. Celestine watched them approach from the kitchen window, her stomach tightening with familiar dread. Samuel appeared at her elbow, his jaw set in that stubborn line she'd come to recognize. "Whatever they want, the answer is no," he said flatly. But Celestine knew it couldn't be that simple. Men like Cyrus Blackwell didn't arrive with lawyers unless they believed they had leverage, and she had a sinking suspicion about what that leverage might be. She was right. They gathered in the front room, all 5 council members plus the lawyer, facing Celestine and Samuel, while the other children watched from the stairs, eyes wide with fear that their fragile security was about to be shattered again. Garrison opened his briefcase with precise movements and withdrew a document. "Mrs. Harrow," he began, and the name still sounded strange to Celestine's ears, or should I say, Mrs. Celestine Harrow, as your marriage certificate reads. "The town council has retained my services to investigate certain irregularities regarding your current situation." "What irregularities?" Samuel's voice was hard as granite. "The marriage is legal, the debts are paid, and we're managing the property just fine." "Ah, yes, the marriage." Garrison's smile was thin as paper and twice as sharp. A marriage between a 28-year-old woman and a 15-year-old boy. Conducted, I might add, with what some might call unseemly haste and questionable motive. "The law allows it," Celestine interjected, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Samuel is the head of household following his father's death. The marriage was legal and properly documented." "Legal, yes. Proper?" Garrison's eyebrows rose. "That's a matter of some debate. The council has concerns about the nature of this arrangement. Specifically, they question whether this is a legitimate marriage or a fraudulent scheme designed to circumvent the council's authority regarding the placement of minor children." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Celestine felt her face flush with anger and something that felt uncomfortably like shame, even though she knew they'd done nothing wrong. They'd played by the rules, used the law to protect the family, and now those same rules were being twisted into weapons against them. "Let me be crystal clear about what's happening here," Cyrus Blackwell said, leaning forward with the confidence of a man who believes he holds all the cards. "This marriage is a sham, a legal fiction designed to keep 7 children in a failing homestead with an unqualified woman playing mother. The council believes that the children's welfare would be better served by the original placement plan. And thanks to Mr. Garrison's research, we've found the legal grounds to challenge the validity of the marriage and resume custody proceedings." "On what grounds?" Samuel's voice cracked with fury. "We followed your damn rules." "Language, boy," Reverend Ashford interjected primly. Garrison consulted his papers. "On the grounds of fraud and deception. A marriage entered into solely for the purpose of evading lawful authority, with no intention of fulfilling the traditional duties and obligations of matrimony, can be annulled. Given that you and Mrs. Harrow maintain separate bedrooms, have no romantic relationship, and by all accounts treat this union as a business arrangement rather than a marriage, we believe we have sufficient evidence for annulment." The words hit like hammer blows. Celestine's mind raced, searching for counter-arguments, loopholes, anything that might derail this legal assault. But she'd been poor all her life, had never had access to lawyers or legal education, and she was facing men who'd bought expertise she couldn't match. "You can't do this." Esther's voice rang out from the stairs, high and fierce. She descended quickly, positioning herself beside Samuel and Celestine, like a soldier joining the line. "This is our family. Celestine is our mother now, and you have no right to tear us apart because you don't approve of how we arrange things." "Child, you don't understand," Blackwell began, but Esther cut him off. "I understand perfectly. You're angry because we found a way to survive without your help. You're angry because Celestine proved you wrong about what one woman could do. You're angry because we're still here, still together, still fighting, and it makes you look bad for trying to split us up in the first place." The truth of her words struck home. Celestine could see it in the way Blackwell's face reddened, the way the other council members shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't really about law or propriety. This was about pride and power, about men who didn't like being outmaneuvered by a desperate woman and a teenage boy. "This discussion is pointless," Garrison interjected smoothly. "The legal challenge has been filed. You'll receive a court summons within the week. Judge Morrison will hear the case in territorial court next month. If the marriage is annulled, custody of the minor children will revert to the council's jurisdiction pending new placement arrangements." He snapped his briefcase shut with a sound like a trap closing. "I suggest you obtain legal representation, though I doubt you'll find anyone in Brimstone Creek willing to oppose the council's position." With that pronouncement hanging in the air like an executioner's blade, the council filed out, leaving Celestine and the children standing in their front room, their hard-won security crumbling like sand. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then May began to cry, and Thomas wrapped his arms around her, his small face fierce with protective anger. The twins looked ready to fight anyone who tried to take them. Nora had gone white as paper, and Esther was shaking, her earlier bravery collapsing under the weight of renewed fear. Samuel turned to Celestine, and she saw something in his face that broke her heart. The look of a boy trying to be a man, trying to hold everything together, and finally reaching the limits of what even stubborn determination could accomplish. "What do we do?" he asked, and his voice was small and lost and terribly, terribly young. Celestine looked at the 7 children who had become her family, at the house they'd transformed from a place of grief into a home, at everything they'd fought so hard to build and keep. Then she straightened her shoulders, pushed down the fear that threatened to swallow her whole, and spoke with a conviction she didn't quite feel, but knew they needed to hear. "We fight," she said simply. "We find a lawyer, we prepare our case, and we fight with everything we have, because they can challenge the legality of our marriage, but they cannot challenge the truth of what we've become. We are a family, not because a piece of paper says so, but because we chose each other, and that's worth fighting for." The children pressed closer, drawing strength from her certainty, even as Celestine silently prayed she could deliver on the promise she'd just made. Because the truth was, she had no idea how to fight a legal battle with no money, no connections, and a whole town council arrayed against them. But she'd figure it out. She had to, because these 7 children had already lost too much, and she'd be damned if she'd let them lose anything more. Outside, the winter sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. It should have been beautiful, but all Celestine could see was the darkness coming, and she wondered if they'd have enough light left to find their way through. The territorial courthouse in Cheyenne was an imposing brick building that seemed designed to make ordinary people feel small and powerless. Celestine stood on its steps with all 7 Harrow children arrayed beside her, dressed in their best clothes, many of them sewn from Martha's fabric, looking like soldiers preparing for a battle they weren't sure they could win. Samuel wore his father's suit again, properly fitted now. Esther had braided her hair with careful precision. The twins stood straight and serious. Even May seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, clutching her mended doll and staying unusually quiet. Franklin Dodds had driven them all to Cheyenne in his wagon, a 2-day journey through melting snow and mud. He stood slightly apart, ready to testify if needed, though his expression suggested he didn't hold much hope for their chances. The council had money, power, and the respected lawyer Garrison. Celestine had only truth and determination, and she was learning that in courtrooms, those commodities weren't always enough. They'd managed to find a lawyer. Barely. Aldous Finch was young, fresh from law school, and so inexperienced that he'd been willing to take their case for the small fee they could afford. He met them on the courthouse steps, his suit slightly too large and his confidence visibly uncertain. "I'll be honest with you," he said, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "This is an uphill battle. Judge Morrison is known for strict interpretation of the law, and the fraud argument is legally sound. If we're going to win, we need to make this about more than just legal technicalities. We need to make it about the children." Celestine nodded, though her stomach was twisted with anxiety. Inside the courtroom, they took their seats at the defendant's table, while the town council and garrison occupied the plaintiff's side with the comfortable assurance of people who'd never doubted they would win. Judge Morrison entered, a stern woman in her 60s with iron grey hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense to the truth beneath. The bailiff called the court to order, and the trial began. Garrison presented his case with ruthless efficiency. He called witnesses who testified about the unusual nature of the marriage, the improper haste of the ceremony, the fact that Celestine and Samuel maintained separate bedrooms and had no romantic relationship whatsoever. He presented documentation showing that the marriage had occurred mere days after the council's custody decision, suggesting calculated deception rather than genuine matrimony. He painted a picture of Celestine as an opportunist who'd exploited a desperate boy to gain control of property and children that weren't rightfully hers. "The law recognizes marriage as a sacred union between two people who intend to build a life together," Garrison argued, his voice ringing with practiced conviction. "What we have here is a mockery of that institution, a legal fiction created solely to circumvent proper authorities and keep 7 vulnerable children in an unstable situation. These children deserve better than a fraudulent arrangement masquerading as family." When it was Finch's turn to present their defense, he called Samuel to the stand first. The boy walked to the witness box with his head high, refusing to be intimidated by the formal setting or the hostile stares from the council table. "Samuel, can you tell the court why you agreed to marry Mrs. Beaumont?" Finch asked gently. Samuel's voice was steady, though Celestine could see his hands trembling slightly where they gripped the witness box rail. "Because the council was going to split us up. They were going to send my little brothers and sisters away on an orphan train, scatter us to different families across the territory, and I couldn't let that happen. We're all we have left of our parents, and family is supposed to stay together. And has Mrs. Beaumont been a good wife? Mother? What would you call her?" Samuel considered this carefully. "She's been what we needed. Not a wife in the way Mr. Garrison means, no, but a partner, a protector, someone who stood between us and the world when everyone else was ready to give up on us. She taught Esther how to make bread that doesn't taste like rocks. She helped me understand Pa's ledgers and figure out how to pay our debts. She holds May when she has nightmares about our parents. She's patient with Thomas, even though he doesn't talk much. She makes us feel like we matter, like we're worth fighting for. If that's not what a mother does, then I don't know what is." The courtroom was silent. Garrison started to object, but Judge Morrison waved him down, her expression unreadable. Finch called Esther next, then the twins, then even Thomas, who'd started speaking again in small, halting sentences over the past weeks. Each child testified with heartbreaking clarity about what Celestine had brought to their lives, not just food and shelter, but hope and security and the knowledge that someone cared whether they lived or died. When May was called, she was so small that the bailiff had to find a box for her to stand on so she could say over the witness box. The judge leaned forward, her stern face softening slightly. "Hello, May. Can you tell me about Mrs. Celestine?" May's small voice rang clear in the quiet courtroom. "She's my mama now. She sings me songs when I'm scared, and she makes the hurt go away when I fall down, and she smells like bread and soap, and she says I'm her sunshine. I love her. Please don't take her away." Her simple honesty hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Several spectators wiped their eyes. Even Garrison looked uncomfortable, shuffling his papers without meeting anyone's gaze. Finally, Finch called Celestine to the stand. She walked forward on shaking legs, settled into the witness box, and placed her hand on the Bible for swearing in. Her mouth was dry as dust, her heart hammering so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. "Mrs. Harrow," Finch began, "why did you stay at the Harrow homestead when you discovered your intended husband was dead?" Celestine took a breath and spoke from her heart. "Because I recognized them. Not personally, but I recognized what they were. People the world had decided weren't worth the trouble of saving. I'd been that person myself, discarded by a husband who found me inconvenient, ground down by factory work that saw me as replaceable as a broken machine part, told over and over that I didn't matter, that my dreams and hopes and heartbreaks were just nuisances to be managed or ignored. When I saw those 7 children standing on that porch, facing separation from the only family they had left, I saw myself. And I decided that if the world wasn't going to fight for them, then I would." "So you married a 15-year-old boy out of what? Pity? Convenience?" Garrison interjected sarcastically from his table. Celestine turned to face him directly, and when she spoke, her voice was steel wrapped in silk. "I married Samuel Harrow because the law you gentlemen write and enforce gave me no other option to protect his family. You created a system that values legal propriety over human welfare, that would rather tear children from their siblings than bend sacred rules to accommodate messy reality. So yes, I used your rules against you. I found the one legal path that let me keep those children together and safe, and I took it without hesitation or regret. If that makes me guilty of fraud, then I plead guilty. But before you condemn me, ask yourselves, what kind of law creates a situation where the only way to do the right thing is to technically violate the spirit of that law? What kind of justice is it that prioritizes paperwork over people?" The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Morrison banged her gavel sharply. "Order! I'll have order in my courtroom." She fixed Celestine with a long, measuring look. "Mrs. Harrow, let me ask you directly. Is your marriage to Samuel Harrow a genuine marriage in your understanding, or is it a legal convenience?" Celestine met the judge's eyes without flinching. "It's both, Your Honor, and it's neither. It's something the law doesn't have good words for because the law was written by people who could afford to marry for love and compatibility, who never had to make impossible choices between keeping children together or maintaining social propriety. My marriage to Samuel is genuine in every way that matters. We are committed to each other's welfare, to protecting the family we've built, to honoring the promises we made when we stood before that altar. It is not a romantic union, no, but it is a real partnership, a real family, and a real marriage in the truest sense. 2 people who choose each other and commit to facing the world together." She paused, gathering her courage for what she needed to say next. "But if this court decides that our marriage doesn't meet the legal definition, if you annul it and return custody of these children to the council, then I'll live with that decision. What I won't do is walk away. I'll apply to foster them, to adopt them, to take them in, under any legal arrangement you'll allow. And if you won't allow any of those things, then I'll move to Cheyenne or wherever they're placed, and visit them every week, write them letters every day, and fight for every single moment I can spend with them for the rest of my life. Because family isn't about DNA or legal documents or social approval. Family is about choosing to love people even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. And I choose these 7 children. I will always choose them." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Celestine saw tears streaming down Esther's face, saw Samuel's jaw working as he fought his own emotions, saw the younger children clutching each other with expressions of desperate hope. She saw Judge Morrison's stern face transformed by something that might have been respect or recognition, or simply the acknowledgement of truth when it was spoken without pretense or decoration. The judge let the silence stretch for a long moment, then spoke in a voice that seemed to fill every corner of the room. "Mr. Garrison, the law allows marriages of convenience arranged marriages, marriages for business purposes, and marriages for dozens of reasons that have nothing to do with romantic love. What the law requires is consent, legal capacity, and adherence to proper forms, all of which were present in this case. You've presented an argument based on the spirit of marriage law, but spirit is interpretation, and interpretation is flexible. What is not flexible is this court's obligation to serve the best interests of the children involved. She turned her sharp gaze to the town council members. Gentlemen, I've heard testimony today that those 7 children are healthy, educated to the degree possible given their circumstances, well cared for, and most importantly, kept together as a family unit. I've heard that Mrs. Harrow has paid outstanding debts, maintained the property, and provided stability in a situation that was rapidly deteriorating. Against this, you offer the argument that the legal technicalities of her marriage are questionable and that her initial motivation was suspicious. I find your priorities disturbing. Judge Morrison's gavel came down with the finality of fate itself. Motion for annulment denied. The marriage between Celestine Beaumont Harrow and Samuel Harrow is legally valid and will remain so. Custody of the minor Harrow children remains with the family unit as currently constituted. Case dismissed. The courtroom erupted. The children rushed forward, crashing into Celestine and Samuel in a tangle of arms and tears and laughter. Franklin Dodds let out a whoop of victory. Even young lawyer Finch looked stunned by his unexpected win. On the other side of the courtroom, Cyrus Blackwell and the town council sat in furious silence while Garrison packed his briefcase with sharp, angry movements. Judge Morrison watched the celebration for a moment, then caught Celestine's eye and gave her the smallest of nods, a gesture of recognition between 2 women who understood that sometimes the rules need to be bent so that justice can stand straight. As they spilled out of the courthouse into the spring sunshine, because somewhere during all the fighting and surviving and loving, winter had finally given way to warmth. Celestine felt something shift inside her chest. The fear and anxiety that had lived there for so long had transformed into something else. Peace. Not the peace of having no more battles to fight, but the peace of knowing she had people worth fighting for and that those people had chosen to fight for her in return. That evening, camped beside the wagon on the journey home, Samuel approached Celestine where she sat watching the stars emerge. He was quiet for a long moment, then spoke in a voice that had lost its hard edge and sounded, finally, like a 15-year-old boy instead of a burdened adult. "When I turn 18, he said carefully, we can dissolve the marriage like you promised. If you want to, I mean. If you want to move on and find whatever it is you might have found if Pa hadn't died." Celestine considered this. She thought about the life she'd imagined when she'd first responded to Tobias Harrow's advertisement. A simple marriage, a modest home, a fresh start. What she'd found instead was 7 children, a failing ranch, a marriage of necessity to a teenage boy, a legal battle, and more fear and uncertainty than she'd ever faced in Pittsburgh. She'd also found purpose, love, belonging, and a family that had chosen her as surely as she'd chosen them. Or, she said slowly, we could leave things as they are. We could be what we've already become. Partners, family, people who take care of each other. It's not a traditional marriage, but it's a real one. And that's enough for me, if it's enough for you. Samuel smiled. A real smile. The first truly unguarded expression she'd seen on his face since the day they met. "It's enough," he said. "You're enough. More than enough." Around them, the other children were settling down for the night, their voices soft in the darkness, their laughter drifting on the evening breeze. May was already asleep in Esther's arms. The twins were arguing good-naturedly about which constellations were which. Nora was singing quietly to herself. Thomas sat close to the fire, his silence no longer quite so heavy. This was her family, not the one she dreamed of or planned for, but the one she'd fought for, the one that had fought for her in return. And it was perfect in its imperfection, beautiful in its strangeness, whole in a way that transcended legal definitions or social conventions. Celestine looked up at the vast Wyoming sky, at stars that seemed close enough to touch, and sent a silent thank you to Martha Harrow, the mother who'd loved her children enough to hide money in a willow tree, who'd provided for them even after death, who'd somehow made room in her legacy for another woman to step in and continue the work of loving and protecting the family she'd built. "Tomorrow when we get home," Esther said sleepily from her bedroll, "can we make Ma's apple cake? I found her recipe in one of the journals." "We can make whatever you want," Celestine promised. "We're home now, and home is wherever we decide to make it together." This story teaches us that family is not defined by blood or legal documents, but by love, commitment, and the choice to stand by each other through impossible circumstances. It shows us that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is stay when everyone expects us to run, that rules exist to serve people rather than the other way around, and that motherhood is not about biology, but about showing up every day and fighting for the welfare of children who need you. It reminds us that the most profound connections often form in the midst of crisis, that healing happens when broken people choose to be whole together, and that sometimes the family you build is stronger than the family you're born into. Most importantly, it teaches that love is an action, not just a feeling. It's the choice to protect, provide, comfort, and fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. Now it's your turn. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Celestine's position? Have you ever had to make an impossible choice to protect your family? What part of this story moved you the most? Should there be a sequel showing what happens as the children grow up? If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button. I bring you stories of courage, family, and frontier life that will make you laugh, cry, and believe in the power of love to overcome any obstacle. Don't miss the next one.